In the fifth episode of Commerce and Culture, Paul Cantor discusses the serialized novel in the 19th century. A lot of his lectures have made me realize how oblivious I have been to a lot of history, it's kind of sad. Just that I didn't have some of this knowledge. This is stuff less than 200 years ago that he's talking about in this episode. And I just don't have, even a basic understanding of how things worked. So in this episode, he talks about the serialized novel and how in those days, people weren't just going out and buying books and reading them. How we might imagine all these people from 19th century England or whatever reading their books in their houses. But that these books came out in series, in magazines, maybe once a week or whatever, and people would read them through those magazines. A lot of this was because the price of books was astronomically higher in those days. He does a little bit, Cantor does a little bit of inflation and says that he thinks basically a book in those days was worth what would be a day's wages now. And a book is obviously nowhere near that at this point, unless you're getting a college textbook or something, in which case it's probably 10 times more than that. But in general, books are much, much less than that now. So people were reading it in these serialized ways. And authors, some liked that, some didn't like that. It put some constraints on them. They had to tell these magazines, I want 20 weeks, I want 16 pages for 20 weeks in your magazine. And then they had to stick to that. They had to be having content that they were putting out in those times. But he talks about how authors like Charles Dickens really took advantage of this system. So he was maybe one of the first to develop this cliffhanger thing, where at the end of an episode, and then Sally knocked on the door. That's like I have to know what happens next. We see this in a lot of TV shows now where they'll put you on this hanger. It's like, well, we have to at least watch the next episode. So it kept people coming back for more. So he really took advantage of this. Another thing that he really used was this idea of using the fans to create some of the story. Cantor talks a little bit about how you have passive fans in some stories and such, and you have more aggressive fans, more passionate ones. And how, you might compare this to like Marvel right now, how there's so many fan theories going on, like, oh, this is going to happen. No, this is going to happen. And so that happened in that day too with some of these stories. But Dickens used that in some of his writing, some of their theories and such that he was hearing, because people might think of this as, oh, he's compromising or selling out, that he's giving the customers what they want and that cheapens the quality. But Dickens realized that even though he may be this really creative person who has a lot of good thoughts, he has got this huge pool of people who are, telling him basically what they want. And so through that, he's able to give a story that's engaging for a lot of different people. So very, very smart. And it kind of plays on this idea of using spontaneous feedback instead of intentional planning, which, he gets into a little bit later, kind of talking about the socialism or Marxist mentality versus the capitalist mentality, and how one works a lot better. But another thing that I thought was really fascinating, he talked about this a little bit in the Shakespeare one as well, but how a lot of people will compare like modern day TV shows and say, look at all the junk that's on TV and look at this stuff back, look at 19th century novels, look at how good they are. And they're such good quality. And now we've just got all this junk. But he draws comparison by saying, I think he said this in the Shakespeare one, but he said that any culture is based off a pyramid of garbage. And that, so what he means by this is, in the 19th century, he does some numbers. He's not quite sure on the numbers, but he says there were probably about 40,000 novels that were written in the 19th century, which is astronomical when you consider that in these days you have about 200 that are still around, even by professors and such who are really into this stuff. Only 200 that are still read. And he talks about how junky a lot of these novels were in the 19th century, but they haven't survived because nobody wanted to read them. So they died off. And so we do this game of comparing. We say, look at all this junk that's on TV, and we compare it to what we have from this 19th century, which is all the best stuff that we still have from them. So he says that the better comparison to do is look at the best of what we have now and what we have in the 19th century. And that's going to be your more even comparison. And you might still say that this 19th century stuff is better, but at that point, you're able to have a better comparison. Instead of comparing the average or the junk from today, compare the best to decide what really is the best quality and such. So he talks about capitalist world is not perfect, that there are things that happen with it that these pressures of having to have these writers coming out once a week. but that he does believe that it's better than any of the alternatives. So he talked about the idea of spontaneous feedback versus intentional planning. And so this Marxist mentality is, oh, we want to have all this stuff planned out and so that we can have this control over it. But in reality, this feedback allowed some of the best stories that everyone wanted and liked. And because of that, there was a lot of success. So I can't wait. He's going to be talking about, Cantor is going to be talking about totalitarianism, if I can even say the word, in I think 2 episodes. I'm sure he'll be comparing that with capitalism and such. So it'll be a really interesting episode. I can't wait to listen to it. And that's my cliffhanger for you to keep coming back.